Hi YouTube, it's Kathy and this is my June 2022 reading wrap-up. If you're not already aware, I do weekly entertainment wrap-ups of everything I read, watch, and listen to, but today we're just talking about the books. This month marked the 9th round of the Queer Lit Readathon, which is just so wild. It's so exciting that in December we're getting the 10th round. Like, what? I have several videos about that, so I'll just link the playlist down below for you. I'm going to start, as always, with the nerdy hardcore stats and charts and then get into what I read. Also, I put chapter markers in all of my videos, so if you want to skip over anything or go back to anything, those are down below for you. On the way down there, make sure that you are subscribed to my channel so you don't miss when I upload a video. In June, I read 22 books for a total of 6,327 pages. That takes into account converting audiobook minutes to pages, so about 2,529 of those pages were actually about 69 hours of audio. The age breakdown for these books was 13 adult books and 9 YA books. I read 15 novels, 3 graphic novels, 3 anthologies, and 1 novella. This month, nearly half of what I read was fantasy and contemporary, followed by science fantasy, science fiction, non-fiction, mystery thriller, poetry, historical fiction, and speculative fiction. If you adjust by page count, predictable things happen. More than half of these books were from the library, but I also read some on Kindle from the publisher, one I bought from an author, one I borrowed, one from an independent bookstore, and some that were free. I read 7 audiobooks, 7 paperbacks, 4 hardcovers, 3 ebooks, and 1 book on the web. The biggest chunk of my books were in the 300 to 399 page range, and everything was published in the last 8 years. The majority of these books were written by female authors, with a few written by male authors, non-binary authors, and 2 books with various authors. The protagonists were a mixed bag that included male, female, non-binary, dual perspectives, and ensemble casts. In terms of setting, 11 were set in the USA, 7 were set in other worlds, 3 were set in Canada, and 1 was set in Hungary. In terms of diversity of subject matter, no surprise there were a lot of queer books. There were also other books that were queer and had some other form of minority identity, hence the combo. 1 was Own Voices for Fat Representation, and 3 had to do with mental health. In terms of star ratings, this month I had 3 3.5 star reads, 8 4-star reads, 6 4.5 star reads, and 5 5-star reads. Let's start with the lowest rated read and work our way up to the highest, shall we? First for my 3.5 star reads is Killer Queens. This is a graphic novel about a guy and a girl. They used to be assassins for hire and they decided to get out of that business when somebody basically wanted them to kill some children, and they were like, yeah, no, we're good. So now they're going around the galaxy doing other things for hire, and sometimes these things happen to do with activism or hench otters or this monkey that really wants his spaceship back. It was a fun time. There were a few connecting points that were a little bit confusing, like some points where I thought maybe I was just missing something in the story, but other than that, this was fun. Next we have Disintegrate, Dissociate by Ariel Twist. This is a poetry collection by an Indigenous trans woman author. If you've been here for a while, you know that poetry isn't necessarily my thing. It doesn't necessarily stick to me unless there's really clever turns of phrase or rhyming or that type of thing. So given I've read a bunch of books between reading this and now, there's not a lot that sticks in my mind besides I enjoyed it while I was reading it. I'm not a big poetry person, but I keep trying poetry because I continuously want to try things that I find a little bit challenging. This collection was short, it was about 80 pages, but it was very, very personal and it gets very graphic at some points, so check out trigger warnings if you need them. Next, the group read for the Queer Romance Readathon was Drag Me Up by R.M. Virtues. This is a Hades and Persephone retelling set in a town called Chaos Falls, where there are different districts that are overseen by different people who we would call gods. They're not really gods in this, but they kind of run the shows, so they're kind of like gods. This had a bunch of different representation in it, and it is also BDSM, so know that going into it. I enjoyed seeing the different ways that Greek gods were put into this and how they were given roles that reflect them as Greek gods. For example, Dionysus, I believe, had a winery, which just makes sense, and then also had a theater, which also makes sense because he's the god of wine and theater. On to my 4-star reads, the first one being We're Still Here, an all-trans comic anthology. It is what it says on the tin. It's, I believe, about 50 different comic writers writing different comic things. Each of the writers is trans, each of the comics has to do with being that. And this was put together in part because sometimes people will be like, oh, we couldn't actually do that type of representation with somebody who is a comic artist because there just aren't any. And it's like, well, here's like 50 of them, take your pick. Like with any anthology, I liked some of these better than I liked other ones. They were all very short, so none of them have really stayed in my mind, but if I were to go and like just skim through it, I would remember things immediately just by looking at the different art styles and that type of thing. Next we have This Rebel Heart. This was my historical fiction, and this was the one that was set in Hungary. This is set in Hungary post-World War II during communism. And that is a period of history that I have not studied extensively, so I was excited to read this with that in mind. Our protagonist is a Jewish woman living in Hungary and wanting to leave because of the terrible things that are happening there. However, that is very difficult to do, so they're having to be very sneaky and making arrangements for this to happen. Just before her and her aunt are about to leave, however, a revolution starts and she finds herself in the middle of it. We also get the perspective of these journals that her father wrote, and that is a whole other side plot because he worked for the regime at one point. He was actually killed because he was accused of certain war crimes, and then later they said that no, he didn't actually do those, and it's like, what is the truth? Another one of our characters was a literal angel of death, so that was interesting. This was mired in Jewish folklore. It was also written in an interesting kind of magical way that I can't really describe. For example, this takes place in Budapest, and if you don't know anything about that, Budapest was two different cities, Buda and Pest, and those cities were originally separated by a river. The river in this really calls to the main character, and at points the river does weird things like turns to stone. There was also a lot to do with color and how they knew certain things were supposed to be certain colors, but they don't see the colors anymore under communism, which was also interesting. It was verging on the point where it was like, this book is a little bit too smart for me and I won't understand all of the little thematic things that are being put in here, but it was a really good read. Next we have My Wife is Missing by DJ Palmer. This is the first book that I read this month, and it's about this family who are just going to New York for a little trip. It's a mom, a dad, and two kids. She hasn't been sleeping very well recently. She's got really big problems with insomnia, so they're hoping this vacation will get her some rest. However, once he comes back to the hotel room after getting food for them, nobody's in the hotel room, and suddenly his wife and his two kids are missing. We get to see this from his perspective as well as her perspective, and we get to try to figure out why she's missing, where she's going, and from his perspective, he's trying to figure out why she's gone, and he has a couple of theories. This took a lot of twists and turns and had a lot of great red herrings. It really made you believe it was going to go one way and then it went another, which I always appreciate in a mystery thriller. Next we have A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, and I haven't rechecked my chart, but I must have put this in Other Worlds because it's set in various different places throughout Europe, so I was probably just like, other. This is a retelling of Dracula, but from his bride's perspective, and his name is never actually said because he is actually very abusive to his bride and then the other people that he brings into their household, and she doesn't want to give him the respect of saying what his name is. You know from the beginning of this that she is going to end his life, and it's all leading up to that happening, but this takes place over hundreds of years. It's queer, it's gory, there's blood, there's sex, there's murder. That's exactly what I expected from this, and that's what I got. Next we have The Cybernetic Teashop by Meredith Katz. This was my novella, and this is something I've been wanting to read for ages, and I'm so glad I finally got around to it. This is an asexual homoromantic romance, and it was lovely. One of our characters doesn't like to stay pinned down too much, so she moves every year or so, and she can do that quite easily because her job is fixing these little robots that everybody has that are basically like companions. This is set a couple of hundred years in our future, and she ends up moving to Seattle, and while she's there, somebody tells her about this tea shop she would probably really enjoy because it is run by a robot, which is not a thing that actually happens anymore. There were some laws, an overturning of laws, so while this robot is allowed to continue to exist, they don't make robots anymore, and this was obviously an intriguing premise, especially because this robot used to live there with somebody who has now passed on because the robot can live for hundreds of years as long as parts are replaced and upgrades are made. This was delightful and cozy and queer. Next we have 90s Kids by Savvy Lycer. This was billed to me as basically a lesbian Back to the Future, and I didn't need to hear anything else. We have two point of view characters. One of them is from 2006 and one of them is from 2015, and somehow they both end up back in 1989. From there, they're going to have to try to figure out how to get back. However, there's government-run people that are trying to basically round them up and send them back, and one of them really wants to live in the 80s as long as she can. can because she feels like she should have lived through that era. The other one is then tasked with helping find this one, and then they run away together, and it's sapphic, it's slow burn. And once time tips into the 90s, they kind of figure out it's time to go home, but also they're not going to see each other anymore, or if they do see each other, there's going to be a huge age difference. This one was fun and interesting and had to do with identity and coming out and what that looks like and how people treat you and how things have changed even in a certain amount of time. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed reading this one. The last two books on my 4-star list are a duology, that's Fever King and The Electric Heir, and I'm just going to talk about them together. Mostly because I can't talk too much about The Electric Heir because I don't want to spoil things that happen in the latter half of The Fever King. Keep in mind when I tell you the premise that the first book was put out in 2019, so the author had no way of knowing what was going to hit the world in 2020. This book is set about 100 years in our future, and it takes place in what was the United States but no longer is. Because there was a plague of magic that knocked out a bunch of the population, basically if you're infected with this virus, within 24 hours you will either die or you'll pull through it and have magical abilities. This is another dual perspective book between two boys. One of them, near the beginning of the book, is infected and lives through it, so now he has to kind of figure out how to live his life, and he's indoctrinated into this government program to train him up. The other boy has been living in this program since he was about 4, and both of them are students of this guy who is about 123 years old because he was one of the first infected, and he uses magic to keep him alive. He also used to be the king of this area and then abdicated, but he's still in the government. This duology has all of the trigger warnings for assault, certain types of assaults of an adult nature that are happening to children, as well as disordered eating, substance abuse, war, blood, guts. So know all of that going in because these kids go through a lot. However, if you can handle that type of subject matter, this was an excellent duology. On to my 4.5-star reads, the first one being Cheer Up, Love and Pom-Poms. This is a graphic novel about two girls. One of them is trans and she's on the cheerleading squad. The other one is kind of a loner. They used to be friends. And she's been told by her mother and the principal that she needs to have something on her transcripts other than she does really well. And she needs to learn some team building skills. So they basically force her to also join the cheerleading squad. This was cute and delightful. It does have some trigger warnings for parents that aren't necessarily the most supportive of somebody who is going through a transition, but by the end it's all love and rainbows and delightful. Something else that is utterly delightful is The Art of Drag. This is a gorgeous large book full of illustrations, and it talks about the history of drag. I really loved reading this book because not only is it beautiful, I also felt like I learned a lot, and there's a lot of things I could continue to learn, and there's a bibliography at the back, so I'm going to be watching and reading other things to build up my knowledge of this art form. Because sure, yes, I do really enjoy watching all of the RuPaul's Drag Race, but that wasn't my introduction to drag. My introduction to drag was going to the drag bar when I lived in Dublin. It makes me really itch to watch more live performances here, and hopefully soon I will feel comfortable doing that. Speaking of things close to home, the next book is The Royals Next Door. This is written by an author who either lives in Victoria or Vancouver now, but it takes place on Salt Spring Island, which is a smaller island off the coast of my island. I have also been there, so it's fun to read a romance book set in a location I've been. This one is about a school teacher whose life is a little bit chaotic. She's kind of a hermit. She lives with her mother so she can take care of her mother because she has mental health issues. She also has her own mental health issues. And they live on this beautiful property that is right next door to this giant mansion. It used to be one big property and this was basically the servants' quarters, but since the land has been bisected and it's two different properties. She also runs a podcast called Romancing the Podcast where she talks about romance books, but she does this in secret, knowing there's a stigma about it and knowing that if somebody judgmental found out about it, there'd be people not wanting her to work with kids anymore, which is just ludicrous. One day she's just trying to get home and this guy stops her in the middle of the road right before her house and she's like, "Who are you? Why are you stopping me?" And he's like, "You need to prove that you live here, otherwise I can't let you continue going through here." And she's like, "Excuse me, who are you?" Like, "No, this is my house, I can do what I want." It turns out he's the personal protection officer for the Duke and Duchess of Fairfax, who are looking to maybe rent a place on Salt Spring Island for about a year. One of the places they're looking at is that huge mansion next door. This is a grumpy sunshine romance. It was a lot of fun. It took place in a place I know. There's another book coming out, I believe this fall, and I think it's a companion book, so it's not the same couple, obviously, but I think it has to do with another one of the bodyguards who is Scottish, and if so, I'm into that. Next we have Tinderbox, The Fire at the Upstairs Lounge, and the Rise of Gay Liberation. This one is both a difficult read and not exactly what I expected. This is about a fire that was intentionally set at a gay club in New Orleans. Up until the Pulse tragedy in 2016, this was the most amount of queer people killed at a queer club in America, because 33 people died and some of them were so badly burned that they couldn't identify, I think, 3 of them. However, I thought this case was going to be a 100% hate crime, and you could say it's a hate crime, but it would have to be an internalized hate crime because, spoiler alert, for an event that happened in 1973, one of the patrons actually set it on fire. This book did a really good job of giving you background on all of the victims, the people that were around the area. It gave a lot of different sources. I thought it was very well put together and it made it an easier reading experience, even though it's a difficult subject matter because you know all of these people lost their lives for nothing. And then after that, people didn't care because it's a queer club. In fact, a few of the survivors went to the museum and there was a whole exhibit about fires that had happened in New Orleans, and even though this is the one that had claimed the most lives, it was not mentioned in that exhibit, which is just so infuriating. This was a difficult read, but it was also a very important one. Another book that has to do with true crime, but this time it's fictional, is the Book of Cold Cases. This is a book about a woman who runs a website of the same name talking about cold cases. So this one isn't true crime, but it's centered on true crime, which is something that I've been watching a lot of recently. A lot of my time is spent watching true crime videos. So this particularly felt very timely for me because it's a big hobby of mine that I spent a lot of time consuming. One day our main character is at her day job and somebody comes in that she recognizes, and she realizes it's this woman who was tried but not convicted of killing some people back in the day, and she really wants to interview her for her website. And then some spooky things start happening. It was fun to see how this case unraveled. There were elements of the paranormal, which I should have seen coming because there were elements of paranormal in the other book I've read by this author, but I just didn't even consider it. And I also enjoyed seeing the protagonist grow over the course of this book. This month I also read Home Field Advantage by Dahlia Adler, and it was just so good. In this dual perspective novel, we have a cheerleader who is queer but not ready to come out because she knows that will hurt her chances of being cheer captain next year, which will hurt her chances of getting a scholarship and going to college after that. She's bi, but her best friend is also gay, and they are in a fake relationship so that nobody finds out that they are queer. During the summer, the head quarterback of the high school team actually passed away, and they needed to replace this person. So it's the first day of school, and people are all excited to find out who this new Jack guy is, and it turns out that Jack is a woman. She's a lesbian, she's super athletic, she moved to the town specifically to be their quarterback, but the team isn't having it. However, the cheerleader thinks she is hot, and she is trying to help her fit in. This was fun and sapphic and believable. I really enjoyed getting to know all of these characters. I really enjoyed all their different interactions. It was just such a good time. And as is tradition, my battery's about to die, so I'll be right back. On to my 5-star reads. Whenever I reread something that is 5 stars, I always put it at the beginning of my 5 stars list, so something else I read that month has a chance of being the best thing I read that month. I mention that because the first thing on this list is a reread, and that's Nimona by N.D. Stevenson. I first read this as a full cast audiobook, and it was fantastic. Absolutely enjoyed that. However, it is a graphic novel about a shapeshifter, so it's fun to revisit this but actually read it on the page and see the different art. Even though in the audiobook it describes what's happening, it was fun to now go through it and see it with my own eyes. Essentially, Nimona is a shapeshifter, and she decides that she wants to be the sidekick to this bad guy. He's not really all that much of a bad guy, as we come to find out, but he is pitted as the villain, and he is at odds with the local hero. Shenanigans ensue. It's a good time. However, everyone's backstory isn't sunshine and rainbows, so be sure to check trigger warnings. Next, we have The Fastest Way to Fall by Denise Williams. This is a book about this woman who is trying to get a writing position at this magazine she's been working at for about 4 years. She pitches this idea where she's going to download this fitness app and then basically take the readers along on the journey so she can review the app. However, there's somebody else who basically wants the same job, and it's decided that she's going to review one of the other apps. They can basically both go on these journeys on these 2 separate apps and kind of figure out which one is better for the readers of this magazine. She is going to try the app called Fit Me, and the other person is trying the app called Hotter You. This one is dual perspective, and the other perspective is Wes. He is the CEO of Fit Me, and unbeknownst to him and unbeknownst to Britta, our writer, they actually get matched up, so he ends up being her coach. They form kind of a connection through the app, talking to each other. He thinks she's really charming. She also thinks he's really charming. They don't really know what each other look like. They don't know anything about each other. He doesn't know that she is writing about the app, and she doesn't know that he owns the app. One day he gets this message from her and all it says is help, and he understandably freaks out because she doesn't continue to send any messages after that. So he ends up using his powers as CEO to get her home address so he can go check on her, and that's when they meet in person. Obviously this is going to have a bunch of different ethical issues because they continue to not know these things about each other. A lot of the things about the fitness industry that Britta brings up in this book are things that I have thought about before, and it was just so refreshing to see that on the page and see how sure, I know that I should be more active because that's just a healthy thing to do. However, if I start working out, it's assumed that I'm doing it to lose weight, and that's not necessarily what I want to do. Sure, I have some extra weight, I'm sure, but that's not what I want to do. I just want to be able to feel good in my body, and I don't want to be judged for trying to do that. And then, of course, the world is full of scams that are just trying to tell you how to do something really quick and easy, and how that's usually not a good thing to do for your body. It's just a mess, but this book actually made me start wanting to do some exercise, which is a big ask because I hate sweating. Next, we have Lake Lore by A.M. Macklemore. This is an absolutely beautiful novel, and if the audiobook is accessible to you, I highly suggest that reading experience because you might recognize those voices. Both the protagonist and the love interest in this book are non-binary, and they end up living in the same town and becoming friends. However, there's also a magical element to this because one of them, the one who has lived in the town all their life, has access to this world under the lake, and the only other person that's ever also accessed it is the one that moves into town. However, the lake is starting to encroach on the town itself, and they have to figure out why and how to stop that. This also has to do with mental health and neurodivergence and rage and emotions, and it was just so absolutely beautifully written. This is my absolute favorite book by this author, and I'm just so proud of them because they've expressed different things online, and I can see that reflected in these characters they've written, and that's just so delightful. The penultimate book on this list is Spin Me Right Round by David Valdez. This is another Back to the Future inspired book about a gay teenager who wants to overturn the rules that people who are going to prom need to bring a date of the opposite gender. Because one, that rule is silly, and two, he obviously wants his boyfriend to be his date. Due to an event I won't spoil for you, he ends up about 30 years in the past and ends up having to go to high school with his parents. He has to figure out why he's there and if he can even go home. In this small town, his mom always talked about this person she knew when she was a teenager who people suspected was queer and actually ended up dying, and they've used it as kind of a reason not to progress too much because they figure if people are out and flamboyant about who they are, then they paint themselves as targets. He decides it's his mission to make sure that that guy doesn't die. This character is just so unapologetically himself, and I absolutely loved seeing that, and I loved seeing him put into this other time frame where that was even less of an okay thing to do, at least from the perspective of you want to be safe. It made various characters grow and understand things better, and I just really, really loved this. I also really loved that I read it in the same week that I read 90s Kids because that was just delightful. My absolute favorite book this month, and it's a debut, and I cannot believe it's a debut, is The Summer of Bitter and Sweet by Jen Ferguson. This is an absolutely gorgeous novel about this girl who has just recently finished high school and is going to spend the summer working at her family's creamery, which is the ice cream stand. She's going to be working there with her best friend and her boyfriend, which sounds like a great summer. However, near the beginning of this book, she actually breaks up with that boyfriend, and he does something incredibly cruel and ridiculous. So that's going to make the summer suck a little bit. In addition, when she gets the schedule, there is another person's name on it, somebody she hasn't seen in years and somebody she used to be really good friends with until he just left town. They had a little bit of a rocky point in their relationship because for the longest time she lied and said that she was white and that she was not anything other than white. However, her mother's family, the family she lives with, is Indigenous. And this not only hurt her family to hear that she was white passing and then just deciding to ignore that part of her identity, but also the friend that comes back into her life is Black. It was hard for him to see her not having solidarity with other BIPOC folk. This book is so aptly named because this summer is bitter and it is sweet. There's a budding romance, but there's also hardship. There's this character coming into her sexual identity. There's queer side characters of other queer identities, and I just absolutely love this one. There's also a section that's kind of a road trip, and it pointed out different places I've actually been on the road trip we took last year, so that was just an added bonus for me personally. If you read any of the books that I talked about today, day, read this one. If you want to hear me talk more about these books, or other books for that matter, the playlist for my weekly entertainment wrap-ups is always linked down below. If you've read any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to make sure that I know you were here, just leave me an emoji or a smiley face if you happen to be on your keyboard. Some people have asked if there's a way to financially support this channel, so I set up a Ko-fi account, which is a digital tipping service. The link for that, as always, is down below. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!